5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And welcome everyone to this episode of the Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Edwards. Joining me from New York City today is Jonathan F.P. Rose, the CEO of Jonathan Rose Companies. Jonathan, how are we doing today?
Very well, thank you.
So Jonathan, your organization, Jonathan Rose Companies, it's fascinated me when I've been doing a lot of research. You've been developing and building affordable communities, healthy communities, insightful communities, educational communities for people in poverty-stricken areas for quite some time. It's pretty impressive for what you're doing. And so I guess the first question I have for you, Jonathan, is when you were growing up in your community, what did you appreciate the most about it?
So the thing I appreciated the most were two things. The first was access to nature. I grew up in a suburb of New York City, and there was a small, I think it was 40 acres of land that had been donated a long time ago by a family called the Butler family. It's called Butler Woods. And I used to ride my bicycle to Butler Woods and play in Butler Woods. And having this access to nature, I loved as a child. And I did all kinds of things. I built forts with friends, and we'd create all kinds of adventures and all that. And we'd come home incredibly muddy and incredibly happy. And that was also a thing where it was a safe neighborhood in which I could ride my bike anywhere. And as I became a teenager, I could easily walk to a train station and take the train to New York City, which was another form of liberation. So those were two wonderful qualities of where I grew up.
And Jonathan, have these qualities, do they manifest in the communities that you build today? I mean, are these communities environmentally friendly? Do they have any of the same attributes that you had when you were growing up?
They do. I grew up in a single family neighborhood, so that is a structurally different thing than the kind of multifamily communities we build. But yes, so number one, we were a very early leader in the focus on transit-oriented development and the need to both reduce our environmental impacts and to improve social relations and to give lower and moderate income people access to jobs and education, healthcare, et cetera. Mass transit is incredibly important. Our company did a really early study in the 90s that showed that the environmental impact of getting to and from a building could be larger than the environmental impact of the building itself. So, for example, a single-family suburban house may use so many BTUs of energy, but could use twice as much energy in the cars getting to and from it. And so, excuse me, we did this early work that showed how important location and transit was to reducing environmental impacts in real estate. And I promoted that for decades, and now that is very common. When I began, there were very few people thinking that way, and now that is very common. When I also began, I said how important mass transit was for reducing costs, not environmental impacts, but also costs and increasing access for people who lived in projects. And interestingly, in the late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s, even the early 2000s, we were such a suburban focused nation that the real estate industry kind of ignored this. And in 2005, I put together an investment fund whose strategy was we were going to only buy buildings that are in walking distance to mass transit. And I don't want to say that was mocked, but the industry did not feel that made a lot of sense. And what we said is this is going to future-proof values. And of course, what happened is that over the last 15 years, the value of transit-oriented development has absolutely been proved that people completely prefer to live in walkable communities, particularly millennial and younger generations. And so the value of real estate that's in transit-oriented locations is absolutely worth more. So it was a great strategy, and it's a strategy I happen to have grown up with.
Okay, so your affordable housing is within walking distances of mass transit for the sole purpose of reducing your carbon footprint or something like that?
So it reduces our residents' carbon footprints, but it also increases their ability to easily get to work in an affordable way. So there, just to give some more context, for working class families in America, there are 20 million families in America that spend more than 50% of their income on housing. And because they are living typically in the suburbs, there's more suburban poverty than urban poverty. They're spending up to 30% of their income getting to and from work. And if there are two people working in a family and then you do two cars, they got to pay car payments and insurance and all that stuff. So they can be spending 30% of their income on transportation, 50 and 30, 80% of their income on housing and transportation, leaves almost nothing left for education, for school. So we know that, number one, when people move from paying 50% of their income on housing to 30% of their income on housing, that reduction, that extra 20% they're saving, leads to longer lives, better health outcomes, better education outcomes for their kids. And the same thing happens when you save the money on the transportation side. So obviously, building affordable housing that only costs people 30% of their income, that's next to mass transit, not only has all these environmental benefits, but has social, health, and education benefits.
So you're coming from New York City, the most populated city in America. I'm sure there's got to be some challenges with development and buildings. Obviously, mass transit is a big issue over there. What are some of the challenges that you've faced throughout, I guess, maybe even since 2005? And maybe explain to our audience some solutions of how you've taken those on.
Okay, so let's back up. So first of all, we are a national company. We work all over the country. And I actually, although living in New York, began my work in Denver in 1989. Our company is 30 years old, where I saw enormous opportunity. So we deal with all kinds of cities and all kinds of contexts around the country. So what we have seen since the Great Recession, let's take it since the Great Recession, is that the housing income gap is greater than ever. So there is now no county in America where if somebody works a full-time minimum wage job, they can afford a rent. And there are only 16 counties where if you're working full-time, to rent a two-bedroom apartment, and there's only 16 counties, which are pretty rural counties, where they can afford to rent a one-bedroom apartment. So we have an enormous income affordability gap. We have this tremendous undersupply of affordable housing. On one hand, for us, that's really good from our economic model, because what it means is our projects, which provide affordable and mixed income housing, are always 100% full and have long waiting lists.
Right.
And if a recession comes, they're only going to have longer waiting lists. So the supply demand is not an issue that we have. There are many other issues we have to deal with. But what we've also seen is dramatically rising construction costs, which make it so all affordable housing is subsidized. And we have not seen the pot of money grow significantly for affordable housing. The most important pot for building new affordable housing are low-income housing tax credits and tax-exempt bonds. Because costs have risen so much, 20 years ago, the federal allocation of tax credits could build 100,000 new affordable housing units a year. In America today, it only builds 50,000 new units. We're losing 120,000 units to gentrification. So as a country, we're going backwards. But what this means is that we're in cities such as New York, that eagerly want to build more affordable housing. They recognize there's a demand. They are bringing their own resources to add to the federal resources to try and grow that supply. But there simply is not enough affordable housing financing to build the amount that each of these cities need. So, for example, in Denver, there are probably, I believe, 8 times as many or 6 times as many applicants for the low-income housing tax credit as there is supply. We're seeing this condition all over the country. So a tremendous need for our product, appreciation for our product, desire for cities to create more affordable housing, also a very substantial recognition that affordable housing should be next to mass transit, but not enough resources to build the amount that's needed.
Right. Yeah. And that's what kind of what I was alluding to is, us as human beings, we're so drawn to culture and big cities. It's impressive. We have all this land, but we just have these hives, like beehives almost, where we all go and we use the same resources and somehow in some way we're figuring out. But I think it was even on your website, you had mentioned like by 2080, these big time cities are going to see some effects of overpopulation, of climate change, of lack of resources. I have a quote from my favorite author, Mark Twain. He says, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." What have you learned from history, and what can history teach us about for planning urban development in future cities to come?
Got it. So I wrote a book about this. I wrote a book called The Well-Tempered City, which starts with the very beginning of civilization and looks at the history of cities throughout time, and then tries to take those lessons for the future and how do we use them to address issues such as climate change and population growth and all that. And by the way, it's not just the large cities that are growing, it's the smaller and medium-sized cities that are growing. And in some ways, in the United States, we're seeing the growth of large cities stabilizing and even beginning to perhaps decline a little bit as people move to, because think of, for example, San Francisco. It's almost impossible for somebody earning a good salary to find an affordable place to live in San Francisco. I know somebody who worked for Google who had a budget of $1 million to buy a house and could not find anything that met the family's needs in the Bay Area. And then they got transferred to Austin and found an amazing house in one of the best school districts in the country. By the way, Austin has like 3 of the 10 best schools in America for $350,000. So it was a complete transformation of what the quality of life was for that family being in another city. So we're seeing that happen more. So let's go to the lessons. So the first thing is we're going to go to the very beginning of civilization. 50,000 years ago, an amazing thing happened to the human species, and it was the unfolding of our ability to have cognitive symbolic thought and develop symbolic language. So language itself is a symbolic system. We use words to represent ideas and other externalities. The invention of language allowed us to socially organize in huge ways and led to the whole advance of civilization. We see the emergence of music, of art, of science, of religion is all happening within 10,000 years of the emergence of language. So all of human culture came from this ability for symbolic thought. So why do I focus on that for the future? Because with the coming of automation and robotics and artificial intelligence, many of the things that humans do today, many of those jobs will be eliminated. So what are going to be the jobs of the 21st century? They're going to me, fall into 2 categories. The first is those jobs based on symbolic knowledge and symbolic language, our ability to be creative, our ability to imagine new things, create symbols of those, which the language, science, etc. are, and then invent new pathways. So remember I said that if you're a minimum wage worker today, you can't afford to, there's no housing you can afford. But what happens when all those jobs are eliminated? So the only way those people are employable is they have this magnificent capacity, expanded cognitive capacity of symbolic language. That is always, symbolic thought has always been the driver at each level of civilization. We need to be preparing our citizens for this very visible emerging future. So that's number one. The second thing that's really interesting is the first building in the world that we know of was this amazing temple in southern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe.
That's right.
And it's about 10,000 years old or so. And before that, maybe we know people were living in caves, and maybe they lived in straw huts, but that's about it. And thatched reeds, but that's about it. And then all of a sudden, there's this enormous, fantastic temple that has huge pillars that are carved. They think it took 500 people to be able to carry them, that are carved with these amazing figures of half man, half beast. And why did this thing exist? And how did it just come essentially out of nowhere? And what it really shows is that humans had a need, and we saw this from the very beginning of civilization. Humans had a need to align with nature. They need to create balance between humans and nature. And it's a very early part and that's at the root of the temple. And for the next 10,000 years, every city was found in a location where there was first a temple. And a great archaeologist says first came the temple, then came the city. And that temple always symbolized this desire for balance of humans and nature. And what we're seeing in the emerging pattern of cities is also this great need for humans to balance humans and nature, that the harsh concrete cities, that they bring with them a lot of psychological issues, et cetera, and that people love to be near parks. And we're seeing cities such as Singapore, which are dramatically densifying by increasing. They're saying now every building has to be at least 50 stories tall. It has to be mixed use, mixed income, and mixed race. They're designing a whole mass transit subway system so every building is walkable. And the reason why is so they can get rid of roads and turn the roads into nature. And infuse the city with nature. And we're seeing the most popular cities in the world have great pathways of nature. Another interesting thing is, so we have Göbekli Tepe, and then out of that comes agriculture, and then we see little towns, and the towns start trading. And the reason they trade is because they have different things. So you have villages that are growing olives, and other ones that are growing figs, and others that are grazing sheep, and other ones that are growing wheat and bulgur, and others that are like making little pots and all this stuff. So people trade because they have different things. If everyone had the same thing, why bother trading? So this amazing network over 1,500 miles called an interaction sphere emerges, and it's all about trade. Now, what is trade? What is this interaction sphere? It is the integration of differentiation. They have different stuff, different ecologies, different cultures, but you're tying it together. A great cognitive scientist named Dan Siegel says the healthy mind integrates differentiated parts. The healthy civilization and the healthy city integrate differentiated parts. So you need two things in a healthy city. You need this differentiation, and you need ways of integrating. I actually think that the recent trade wars that our country is engaged in is the exact antithesis to this. I mean, we're seeing countries increasingly trying to isolate themselves, which is really dangerous, because what you see is the evolution of civilization evolves from this integration of differentiated parts. So, but anyway, that is, so there are all these lessons that you can just literally look at how civilization grew, and then you can say, so what do we need for the future? So for the future, we need, the healthiest city. So why are New York and London, and if you look at the most prosperous or influential cities in the world, and they're the ones that are trading, that are globally connected, that are integrating differentiated parts. I'll tell you another story about that. So in 1953, or in the 50s, well, in 1950, Birmingham, Alabama, and Atlanta, Georgia had exactly the same population, and they had exactly the same income within 1,000 people of population, within $1,000 of median income. Delta Airline goes to them both and says, we want to become a regional airline, and we want to connect globally. And Birmingham, which was very inward looking, said, we don't want that. We don't want those trade unionists coming down from Chicago. We don't want those Mexicans coming up from Mexico City, which are places that Delta wanted to start flying to. And so they raised their commercial fuel tax to make it harder for Delta to be there. Atlanta said, bring it on. We're actually going to issue a bond issue and help you build a new airport. Okay. 30 years later, Atlanta is 4 times the size, more than 4, I can't remember the size, but at least 4 times larger in population, 4 times larger in population, and has twice the median income. And it all came from being a connective place versus an internal looking place. So prosperity comes from connectivity. Now, the other issue we have to deal with in the 21st century, which we learned primarily from the history of indigenous cultures, is we currently have a linear economy. So we have an economy, it's an extractive economy in which we take stuff from the earth, other resources. We use them, we chew them up, we pollute a lot in making them, and we throw them out. 96% of the things that enter a city leave it 6 months later as waste. We need to move to a circular economy and a regenerative system of economics. Our economic system now rewards you for spending the least amount on the common good by polluting the air, polluting water, exploiting people. The more you can save, you can create profit for a company and save and not spend on the common good, the better. A regenerative economy is one that rewards you with profit for best enhancing the common good, for making the most contribution to the whole. So we're going to have to figure out, and we're seeing capitalism fraying. We're seeing with income inequality and social unrest, polarization. We're going to have to, and revolution is not a good thing. Revolution is a very destructive thing. So we're going to have to think of an evolutionary way to move from our current vision of capitalism to a more regenerative vision of capitalism.
Interesting. And has there been any instances of a regenerative economy that's been
in many
successful in the past?
In many indigenous cultures, we see regenerative economies. And in many agricultural cultures, we see regenerative economies. We see self-sustaining economies. I'll give you an interesting contemporary example. There's a company called Lime Timber that buys forests. It puts them in sustainable yield systems so that they are only cutting trees that are appropriate for the health of the forest and that actually create space for trees to regrow. They then build sawmills adjacent to the forest that is designed for the sustainable cut. So you can go to the people who are employed there and say, there will be jobs here 100 years from now. Because this isn't a slash and burn. It's not like we're going to abuse the forest and then 20 years down, close the sawmill and you're all out of work. So it's all in balance. And the forest is regenerating continuously. So it means the trees are growing back. So there'll be more future for the employees in the sawmill. So I can give you other examples. That's a very clear, simple example. What's a regenerative economy? And actually, the more you nurture the ecology of that forest, the better the economic health of the community will be.
Yeah, Jonathan, it's interesting. I was just interviewing Pete Gombert, the founder of Indie Dwell. It's another affordable housing company, but what they do for their affordable housing is they regenerate shipping containers into homes. Right. So that was another example of a circular economy, a regenerative way to sustain affordable housing, quality housing for people in communities. You were mentioning, now let's just reflect on that a little bit, Jonathan. That was a big summary of what we can learn from our past that we can implement in today's day and age, especially when it comes to affordable housing in communities. One of the examples I like to give is Teotihuacan. Are you familiar with Teotihuacan in South America?
Yes, but tell me what your example about it is.
Okay, so Teotihuacan is like, for people listening to this for the first time, it's to my understanding, it's the first civilization from the Aztecs. So it's the people that originated from the Aztec Empire. One of the first civilizations in the Americas, and no one seems to know quite exactly what happened to them. From some archaeologists say, the city had a massive uprising, that they wanted to kill the people that were in charge and held the power. But one theory suggests that they expanded and built so much that they devastated the forests and the agriculture within it and starved the communities. So this is another example of what maybe, or when you refer to a linear economy, maybe some things that we can take from our past that we can look going forward. You also mentioned Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, another civilization that is under some scrutiny right now. Some people are kind of debating what really happened there, but it seems to be that was a place of, like you said, differentiation and integration, a place that was purposely buried, actually, because of who knows? Was it a flood? Was it a meteor that came down? We really don't know yet. But the last thing I wanted to mention, and this will be the prelude to my question, is agriculture. Sustaining agriculture. For me, from what I've been taught, is agriculture is the reason for communities. It was the rachis of rice, the rachis of wheat, that people unintentionally domesticated, that produced higher yields of grains, which basically made the hunter-gatherers stop hunting and gathering and say, hey, we have a sustainable food source here. Communities, arts, everything comes together now because of this domestication of these wheat and flour and plants. So the question I have for you, Jonathan, after that long prelude is, what are you doing in your communities to sustain food sources, and how important is it for these communities to have healthy foods?
Got it. I just want to go back to the Aztec example for a second.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because what we think happened, and this is, by the way, a warning for the future, which is that every time so what civilizations do when they're prosperous is they expand to the very limits of their environment. So as cities grow, they create more fields and more fields and more fields to feed them and to for that agriculture to work. They bring in more and more irrigation and blah, blah, blah. And then a drought comes. And so they maximize this for kind of like maximum water flow.
Right.
And then a drought comes and the fields don't produce as much. And all of a sudden there's not enough food. So what we observe is that when the civilization has vast income inequality and the people, and basically the food supply is more limited and its distribution is unequal, then the people riot. And you can tell they riot because the cities are destroyed. You can see they're burnt. You can see like the way that they were destroyed in violence. When civilizations have more of a sense of fairness and equality, they just peter out. So, there's not enough food, so people drift off, they go migrate somewhere else, some starve. The whole thing contracts. So solving income inequality is really important. So we're at that state now. Clearly, climate change is coming, and clearly our food supplies are going to be threatened and potentially reduced by it. There may be technological solutions, but food, we're in a unique state in the world where we are feeding more people than ever. I mean, there's less starvation as a proportion of population than ever. But climate change is going to put that at risk. And if our distribution of food is unequal, we are going to see political trouble. So what are we doing about this? So low-income people often do not eat or eat very poorly for at least a week a month because their budgets are so tight. So we do several things. So first of all of our projects have community gardens, and we try and encourage people to grow healthy food. And we try and speak to them about healthy food because low-income communities often only have access to really bad for you fast foods. And the second thing is we connect our projects with either what are called mobile groceries or mobile food banks, et cetera. Food share, there's different programs in every city and state, but our goal is to connect our residents to as much healthy food as possible.
That the idea to differentiate and integrate into these communities, is this something that most real estate developers are paying attention to, or what's the common understanding amongst your industry about what we need to be thinking about in the long term as we start developing all of these suburban and sustainable, affordable housing?
So it's interestingly how it's evolving. So first of all, in the affordable space, so just one more thing. We are deeply, our future in America and many other places in the world is deeply determined by zip code. So those who live in the healthiest zip code will statistically live 20 years longer than those who live in the least healthy zip code. Those who, I grew up in a zip code where 95% of the kids went to college, and the zip codes where 0% of the kids go to college. Our mission as a company is to actually overcome this misallocation of opportunity in zip codes, which we feel is a social justice issue. So our goal is to take affordable mixed income housing, which is often in low opportunity communities, and bring on-site after-school education programs and access to healthy food and access to health care and a variety of things to improve the health and well-being of our residents and help lift them to higher opportunity. Now, that's our mission. And, as I said, our field is affordable housing. We're often in lower-income communities. There are similarities between that and what the regular old real estate industry is doing. The regular old real estate industry used to just provide a place to live. And starting in the 2000s, there was an amenity war race where people were adding more gyms. Now, we have put exercise rooms in all of our projects because it's part of the health program for our residents. But you're seeing bigger and better gyms and community rooms and community kitchens and all this stuff happening in market rate real estate. And market rate real estate is now competing with not only social programs suited for its residents, but a lot of focus. So many market rate projects now offer yoga classes and meditation classes and all that stuff. So we have different objectives. Their objective is the health and well-being of their residents. Ours is more of an opportunity focused, but we're seeing the amenitizing of real estate and the socializing of real estate as a theme across all sectors.
Jonathan, have you found your employees are going or being driven to your company because of this purpose, because of this idea to sustain these affordable cities and really help out people in their own lives? Absolutely.
So that is a significant competitive advantage. So it's got two sides to us. We need mission-focused people to do mission-focused work. So being so emphatically and clearly mission-focused helps us attract the right people and not attract the wrong people. Mm. And then it helps with stickiness because people can find meaning and purpose in working with us.
Yeah, and we've found that with a lot of the companies that we've interviewed. They've all said that exact same thing. It's interesting why you would do anything else, I guess. Right.
So, I say that people are purpose-driven beings, and we grow towards purpose the way trees grow toward light. And the problem is that in many cases we don't think there's an opportunity to integrate our work and purpose. But when people find that there is, it's deeply fulfilling.
Well, Jonathan, we've talked about a lot today. We've talked about kind of your upbringing in your communities, what you learned, what attributes you've taken from that and implemented into your projects nowadays, your company nowadays. Talked a lot about history. We went on a big rant about Teotihuacan, Göbekli Tepe, what we can learn from our past that we should be planning for in the future. So to stay on that topic, though, you said in 2005, we're planning for mass transit to reduce these carbon emissions. Is climate change something that you planned for in 2005? Yeah. Or when did you start realizing that, hey, this thing has the potential to, one, wipe out a lot of communities and really do something to food supply?
So I just want to correct that. You would ask me about 2005. So our company was founded in 1989.
Right.
And in 1989, one of our very first principles is that we would only develop projects next to mass transit. So we were really, and that was a time in which America was vastly suburbanizing. Almost no one else was thinking that way. So the idea of transit was deep in the DNA of the company. The idea of reducing our environmental impacts was also deep in the environmental in the ethos of our company. And back then, we didn't have LEED or other systems for how to green buildings, so I had to invent my own. But so I actually created a whole internal guideline system. And we were a tiny company at the time, but still. So from the very founding of the company in 1989, we tried to figure out how we could consume less energy, reduce our climate and environmental impacts, reduce our water consumption, and reduce the use of toxic materials in our buildings.
Jonathan, didn't your organization have something to do with bringing internet access to some of the first communities?
Yeah. So I graduated from college in 1974, went to a little bit of graduate school, started working real estate in 1976 for my family's real estate company in New York City, which is a very reputable market rate multifamily company, and learned the trade of real estate development, always wanting to be more social and mission oriented, and left and started in 1989 and started my own company. But in 1979, I took a leave of absence because I was living in Lower Manhattan. I was in Soho. I was like, as part of a whole other culture that was going on then. And I knew stuff was happening down there and I wanted to be part of it. And so I proposed a project to my family's business that they did not want to do. So I kind of took a leave of absence and renovated an old loft building on the edge between Soho and Tribeca called the American Thread Building. And I saw that that whole community is about living and working in arts and creativity and all that stuff integrated. And I could see that the future of work was the digital realm. Now, this is before the PC was invented. And so I put together the first building in the world that came with internet access in every unit. The fastest modem you could buy then was 300 baud. And we had to connect everybody with dumb terminals and then eventually replace them with Apple IIs. There were only 2 ISPs. It was a very primitive internet at that time. And by the way, since there was no home consumer market, it was all software in the cloud. So if you wanted to use word processing, you had to go through this incredibly low speed to some word processing program somewhere in Bethesda, Maryland. But anyway, so we created the first live-work building. It's an incredibly innovative building full of all kinds of fascinating people. That was the first building in the world that had internet access for every unit.
Now, fast forward to 2019. Are there any tech innovations out there that you see coming that are a humanity shifting idea that could really have this paradigm shift in how affordable housing is built and how people connect and operate?
No,
nothing else.
I mean, no, there's lots of stuff that's happening, but you say total paradigm shifting. Obviously artificial intelligence will be paradigm shifting. It won't change. Well, I have a vision for how we build, but this is going to take another 30 years. So it's not a 2019 vision. So in 2019, I see the growth of information. What we really need to do is to be able to bring our information together in more coherent ways, harmonize it, and dive into it and use it to figure out how to operate better and how to serve people better. But the big issue probably in 2020 is going to be data privacy. And this is going to impact every company because increasingly legislation is going to make us responsible as holders of our resident or customers' data. And so that's an area and most of us, we use a third party, like in real estate, almost everybody uses a firm called Yardi that does our accounting, et cetera. So we're going to be liable if they screw up. This is going to be an interesting thing.
Jonathan, you said the vision in 50 years. Are you a visionary? Would you consider yourself a visionary? And how important is it for the leader of a company to share their vision with the others?
I do think it's important to have a vision. And I think it's particularly important to have a social ecological vision, a vision. We live in a world with a tremendous amount of challenges. And I believe there are many forces for good. I believe that academia can be a force for good. Government certainly can be a force for good. And the private sector absolutely can be a force for good. But it'll only be a force for good if we have a vision towards the world we want to create and a vision as to what our pathway would be to get us there. And then an understanding of what the steps are that we need to begin taking to get us there. And you have to communicate that to all your employees because we all have to act as a cohesive whole on a pathway going somewhere.
Well, Jonathan, appreciate your time coming on the show today. Your impact that your company has been able to make is why we are talking today as a part of Jonathan Rowe's companies being featured on the Aurelius Impact Awards, featuring the 100 top impact companies of 2020. So the last question I have for you, Jonathan, is what is your definition of a real leader?
So my definition of a real leader is so a company. So I'm going to go back. A real leader is like a farmer. So a great farmer's job is to create amazing soil from which the plants will come. If the soil is healthy, everything else works out. If the soil is healthy, there's nothing that works out. And amazing farmers are always through crop rotation and fertilization and organic methods. And if they care for the soil, everything comes from that. So the same thing in a company and in a society, actually. I believe our job is to create the company as a fertile and generative soil from which our people can be leaders. Our people can carry things out. Our people can work in teams. Our people can be happy and can create a better future. I've talked about the common good before. So our job, and some of this is like really practical systems we have to make sure that happen, and policy we have to make sure happen. A lot of it is culture we have to make sure happens. But our job is to tend to the soil of our companies. And if we can do that well, everything else will take care of itself.
Well said, Jonathan. Well, for Jonathan Rose, I'm Kevin Edwards, asking you to go out there and nurture your company, till the soil, and always, folks, keep it real. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.